it is really, really challenging at the moment to engage people. And so I'm thinking about how we can reimagine, reinvent, transform HR. Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, everybody. A great choice to be here today. Mihai and his team always put on an absolutely fantastic event, so it's great for me to be here again. Yes, I think if we build on some of the things that Ashish was sharing, it is really, really challenging at the moment to engage people. And so I'm thinking about how we can reimagine, reinvent, transform HR so that actually the people experience that Ashish talked about, the deployment of technology, smooths the path for people to feel like they're contributing very well to their enterprise and taking things forward. And it's a terrific opportunity for us to take things on and showcase where we go with this. So as Mihai said, I'm very busy and I do an enormous amount of work in different guises. So let's start by having a look a little bit more about what I'm going to cover today. So and thanks to our sponsors, of course, who are on that slide there, because without them this wouldn't be possible, and help Mihai and the team. We recently celebrated in my organization 10 years of operating. And if I go back 10 years, the kind of things we were worried about were the deployment of technology, like Ashish was talking about, and perhaps robots taking our jobs. I think we've got a bigger range of things to be worried about, and I'll talk about those in a second. But just a little bit about me, as Mihai said. Fantastically proud to have been named the #1 most influential thinker in HR by HR Magazine in June this year. You can find me on TED and TEDx. There's a couple of talks I've got about the future of work. I'm a LinkedIn learning instructor. I'm very, very pro non-hierarchical self-managed organizations, which is why I qualified this year in the Semco Style Institute's Self-Managed Expert Program. We're a democratic organization. We're also a B Corporation, so we really care about community, about the environment. We're a climate positive organization, and we're also a 4-day working week. And there's currently a big trial in the UK with 3,000 employees across a range of companies who are recalibrating the working week from 5 days to 4. And so far, 86% of those in the trial are saying we're going to carry on and continue with 4-day working weeks. So we're proud to be in that collection. But as I said earlier on, we've got probably more problems to challenge us and take forward our businesses in times of incredible turbulence. We have wars, we have a climate emergency, we have ecosystems under enormous pressure with agriculture, water, floods, and freak weather conditions. Of course, the pandemic held us in a grip for a couple of years, and there's potentially still an emergence with diseases that we need to be careful about. We have political polarization, and perhaps if you look at the United Kingdom at the moment, a degree of incompetence. We have the digitization of everything. We have the intrusion of technology into our lives increasingly more, as well as utilizing technology. Cybercrime predictions will look at something like 2025. $12 trillion worth of business will come through the cybercrime arena. So, I mean, I call it business, but of course it's the dark side. We've got the financialization and the fragility of economies, and certainly we're feeling that in the UK at the moment with the pound tanking. We therefore have a sort of a concurrent cost of living crisis, and HR's, I guess, sort of response to that is to try and look at how it can create as much benefit and financial stability for its people. I don't think we anticipated that too much a couple of years ago. And then, of course, we've got lots of social injustice. We have protests. We have all sorts of unfairness that we've got to consider in the workplace as well as in our societies and communities. So it's really tough to get your head around all of these issues and what that means for the world of work. So hanging on to hope is a little bit difficult. And I think there's something about how do we respond to that in HR? How do we reposition ourselves, look at the capabilities and the value that we create? And I'm going to talk to you as much as I can about what I think that looks like. But first, let's go on a bit of a journey. HR's origin, if you can track it back as far as the 1800s, was around the concept of worker welfare. It was the realization that people, as a vital part of enterprises, business, and community service, we needed to look after people. So, in salary sense, in health sense, in living sense, in education sense, which turned into the sort of mid 20th century version of what we would possibly call industrial relations or employee relations. And then there were unionized representations and voice to change things for the better for the people in the workplace and still create thriving businesses. So it was all about balance and inclusion and influence. We saw personnel arrive in probably the 1970s and 1980s, which took it to a lot more of sort of processes and very sort of rigorous ways of employing people and helping them understand and appreciate what they're there to do. And then we had HR. HR kind of emerged in the 80s and 90s as human resource management, lots of science, lots of new techniques, things like performance reviews, things like reward and recognition mechanics. And then that's kind of morphed more recently into people and culture. That's the kind of frame that lots of people put around it. We see lots more chief people officers, more than perhaps we do vice presidents of HR. So we've got that kind of people word symbolizing what we do. But I think the irony of working in a technologically charged and pandemically affected world is that we've returned to worker welfare. We are looking at how can we look after as well as enable our people. And we heard from Ashish when he talked about psychological safety. We heard about inclusion and how we can listen and help people find that quality experience of work. Some of that is through our duty of care. So it's ironic we've almost gone back to the roots of it, which is looking after people. Now, when I talked about HR, you may be familiar with this from the work of Dave Ulrich from the Michigan School of Business. This model of HR was introduced around about 1997, 95, something like that, and was built on three pillars of support and enablement for organizations through their people practices. So we probably don't need to unpack this very heavily because most HRM lectures and study programs will talk to this, but just a reminder, shared services with the kind of technology that Ashish was talking about, which is clearly advanced since the 90s, technology enabled service provision. We had centers of excellence where we had experts in psychology, in organization design, in learning and performance who would work on the kind of mechanics of how we enable people and how we deploy resource to get the best from those people. And then we had business partners, which was probably the newest introduction at this point in time. Client relationship managers, people who were operating in a sense of understanding the business need, turning that into an HR requirement, and deploying and enabling HR solutions to some problems like high attrition, low performance, learning and development needs, and so on. Now, that model is probably still around, and lots of people would probably point to their HR structure and it would still have these hallmarks. Now, as Mihai said, I wrote a book in 2017 that was refreshed in 2021 with a second edition, where I wanted to see a little adaptation to that particular model. I didn't want to completely depart from the principles of clear accountability and interconnectivity within HR. So I created these 4 zones to try and see if we can get a little bit more pliability and adaptability in the HR world, because my experience of working in it, and then since working with it in client sort of sense and service and supply, is that the 3 verticals were sometimes not exactly cohesive. There was a little bit of baton passing and perhaps an unclear nature to who owned relationships, who owned the service provision, and who therefore owned the value and the impact. So this you'll see, and Ashish talked about the bread and butter of HR. Some of these are the kind of roles that HR people in the sort of mid-20s were starting to pull together. So employee experience is in there, diversity and inclusivity is in there, people and business intelligence is in there, and things like business analysts who are looking at results in the way that Ashish talked about, with the aggregation of all that data so that we can see trends and we can start to be more wise in the decisions that come from that data set. But also things like change, research programs, future skills, increasingly, what HR was being asked to do was map a route to the future to help organisations skill ready for new technology, for different business models, and for different client, customer, and service demands. So this model that I put into the world in 2017 and refreshed in 2021 is operating in some organisations that I know of who read the book and wanted to kind of recalibrate what it is they're all about. And you'll notice I sort of subtly changed the titles from shared services, business partners, and centre of excellence to people strategy and partnerships, to people performance and development, to people and program support, and then for people and organisational transformation. Those were the kind of headlines that I was trying to capture with this model. But was it enough? I'm not sure it was, because these are the kind of demands that we are seeing. And Ashish talked about this in his opening, from some of the company needs and some of the market demands. We are looking at the sense of economics as being something that has to have a regenerative feel, whether it's invest to grow, whether it's diversification. There's often something about, can we make sure there's a regenerative economic field and an economic proposition for us as an organization, and therefore that we can use to sustain our performance into the future. Now, the emerging tech and advanced digitization has been with us for some time, but in the sort of COVID responses, we saw an acceleration of that with remote working, with use of digital connectivity like we're seeing now today. But alongside that, a lot of people kind of reset their expectations and actually rewired their lives, because this whole kind of sense of work as a purpose, it has to have meaning. We looked at some roles in the world of work and called them low skill roles, logistics, retail, and so on. Now, during the pandemic, they became key workers because they kind of kept the world going whilst we were locked down and sat still. And I think that sense of purpose is something that's really coming through strongly for people. They want to feel like they make a difference, they matter, and their work is important to not just them, but the world. And then on top of that, we have things like agile operating systems, where people are trying to constantly tune their machinery of work into customer demand, technology advances, and people's expectations. The value chain principle of how we can optimize at each stage, perhaps of production or service delivery. And another big requirement, I guess, has come through the climate emergency, with environmental, social, and governance now being an incredibly hot topic for organizations, in terms of how do we make sure we are doing the right thing, we are being fair and equitable, and we are looking after the planet and people, as well as our sustainable revenue streams. Within that is the emergence of a need to be sharper around strategic people planning. Some research in the UK in 2021 looked at this from a strategic workforce planning perspective and asked 90 companies, how do they do this? But only 43% of them said they have a robust mechanism for strategic people planning, meaning the other 57 are quite hopeful, chance, reactive, and perhaps not quite as strategic in their intent. And of course, we need to learn a whole new range of capabilities. And Ashish again talked to those. The kind of human AI bot interface is clearly something where we need some advanced capabilities, both in the workforce that we support and in us in HR to program, build, and deploy those kinds of technologies. So the demands are huge, again, coupled with those macro level issues. Now, this is a model that I devised ready for the refresh version of transformational HR. I've called it 42 at Work. And if you know anything about literature and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy book by Douglas Adams, there is a quest in that book to find the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. And the answer, quite flippantly, was 42. So that's why this is 42, because it could be the answer to the meaning of life, the universe, and everything when it comes to work. It starts with the value side of things. What value is the organization there to create, but connected to individual sense of what they value in life? And that's where we kind of need to do this alignment piece before we even get going on what work needs to be done. So if I value civic duty and community service, I am likely to want to work for an organization where the value that's created is aligned to that. And perhaps that's local government, perhaps that's a non-profit, perhaps it's a humanitarian organization. But if I value lots of money in a sports car, I might go and work in commercial banking, because that what value is created in that environment. So that's a very important alignment piece we don't always think about. Now, if we follow this model left to right, it acts as a design tool. It helps us understand the design that we need for the organization and the systems that we operate with, the principles, the kind of value set and the culture that's really important to us, that helps fuel the energy of the people who work there. And then the tools that we deploy within HR help us with accountability, so people know what their expectation is, the clarity of outcome and the ways of behaving, and the togetherness, how we link when we need to, how we support each other, how we can learn together, and so on, right the way through to what I call a state of flourishing. That's a flourishing organization and flourishing people within it. Now, if it goes wrong and flourishing isn't the outcome, we can go from right to left to find where the failure point is to put that right. So it might be that we haven't got enough development, we haven't got enough recognition. Well, let's work on those. So that's the idea behind this tool. So Ashish's data that he was talking about would be incredibly useful in this model. So if we've got this model as a starting point for what an individual employee experience looks like aggregated to an organization's experience, how do we deliver that within HR against those huge macro issues and against those very strong demands that we saw earlier on those slides? Well, we need people who can understand what the meaning of work really is, what it means to people, and what value is being created, and why the organization exists in the first place. And sadly, when I talk to a lot of organizations, we've kind of lost that. We've forgotten it. We've diluted it. It's not as important as it should be. So I think there's something about restating purpose and restating that meaning and aligning it across the value chain that I think we need to do. We clearly need people who can design systems. Organization design professionals obviously sit in that space, but it's more than that. It's also processes at quite a low level, compliance and so on. Then we need some product managers. Now, these are people who will build the things that people use to access benefits, to access development, to understand how they can create a career path, to understand what happens when there's a maternity situation, whatever it might be. We need products. We need people to build things that other people can use. And then that needs to be supported by an operations team who absolutely know end-to-end employee lifecycle, can run recruitment campaigns, can think about onboarding, can think about development programs, can think about apprenticeship schemes, and so on and so on. And experts. We still need experts, people who know employment law, people who understand the psychology of motivation, people who can work on strategic agendas, people who can research and analyze data. And that links to analysts. And Ashish talked about that with his exercise earlier. But we also need some science. I think we need more science in HR, actually, not less. So people, occupational and organizational psychologists have a lot to offer in understanding the dynamic of when people come together with a challenge or an opportunity, when we scale, how we mature, how we adapt, how we diversify. So I think there's a real strong need to kind of think differently about those roles within HR. Now, in 2021, I did some research. It was more meta research. I researched research and I aggregated something like 40 reports from Gartner, McKinsey, and the recognized big sources of it, vendor surveys, a bit like Ashish was talking about earlier on, and brought that together in a report called the State of HR 2021. We're going to do a new one in 2023, so look out for that in the new year. But importantly for me, I wanted to know the skills of the future according to those projections from those people. And here's the kind of aggregation of that. These are the things that 40 organizations looked at and said, these are most valuable when it comes to capabilities and skills. So performance analytics, psychology is in there, of course, experience designers, as we heard from Ashish, data science, again, as we heard from Ashish, org design, engineers in code, systems thinking, being able to understand all that kind of interconnectivity, the meaning makers I talked about, psychology of learning and agility so that we can respond to things. So if those are the skill sets, how does that map? So I've taken that kind of 4 interlocking circles that I produced in 2017, and this is kind of the big reveal. This is how I think we could reimagine HR. Systems designers who can interoperate with performance analysts and meaning makers and product managers to help us create a much more responsive, adaptable and sustainable model for our organizations into the future. Product managers who can build those things that people need with an acute sense of consumerism about how we access ticketing services, how we book and buy online, but how we turn that into a work-related proposition. Those psychologists I talked about, the practice leads, People operations to hold it all together with the technology enablement and the process compliance and so on and reporting. But at the heart of it, those meaning makers who can talk to strategists, who can talk to the board, who can look at the market demands and say, this is the meaning of what we are here to do. And here's the meaning of the challenges we're facing and what we need to do to turn them into systems, product, and test them with psychology and analytics. Now, that's all good as a model, but how do we do that? So here's a little bit of a playbook of the early thinking that I'm coming up with this. So this model doesn't exist anywhere. It's quite literally, this is the first reveal of my thinking about what this model could do to depart from 3 verticals or even interlocking practices. The meaning makers will use that reason for being, the strategic vision, the business model, the impact narrative. And by that, what I mean is, what does success look like for us in a balanced, sustainable way? So not just profit, but community service, net zero, carbon reduction. All of those things have an impact and therefore are part of our narrative about, if we exist, this is what we will measure as success. And the prosperity criteria talks to how we can regenerate our economic proposition and look after our people with cost of living crises and so on. And we create from that what I call the people proposition. It's like, why should you work here and what can you expect if you come to join us? That translates into a strategy so that we can really start to see how that looks in a kind of operating sense, and has to connect to things like ESG, environmental, social and governance, so that we can see how the human resource agenda absolutely plays into the priorities that go beyond simply operations and into the whole schema of things about community, about compliance and about looking after the environment. And of course, very strongly in that as well is equity and inclusion. This is not something sunken inside one key role that helps people with employee representative groups. This is how are we equitable and inclusive and can leverage difference. And so we're a welcoming, appealing place for people to belong to. That then translates into our systems designers, who can then start to work on the organization design and the operating model and those things we're perhaps more comfortable with now. But a team that can act very fluidly to a merger and acquisition or a new market opportunity or a compacting exercise where we're starting to sort of consolidate products and services so that we can stick to our core capabilities. The process design, the inventory of resources that we need in order to deliver that, so that's technology and materials. And the performance infrastructure. How do we know we're performing well? How do we reward that? How do we make sure it's sustainable, balanced and fair and that we don't burn people out and so on? So the operating system manual, I suppose you could say. And then linked to that, a whole series of products. And I think the reason I talk about products is this is how it works in the technology world. You have product managers who own something that's part of a technology infrastructure to deliver a service and absolutely will make sure from end to end it does exactly what it's there to do and can be maintained and sustained and adapted and iterated upon. So I think we need a much more product orientation to HR and what it does. And then linked to that, the psychologists absolutely can help us understand what is the cognitive, emotional, social, psychological aspects of everything we do in the workplace. We still have too many toxic leadership principles that are adopted by some. We still have some very confusing rhetoric about, yes, we're here to look after people, but we'll burn you out. I mean, there's things like that that are incongruent. I think we need some psychological and scientific evidence-based inputs to help us understand, how do we get this right? How do we adapt to changing demands and needs and different demographics and so on? And linked to that, there is a strong performance analytical approach. How well are we doing across a range of different factors, not just the bottom line, but how people feel, how their energy is, how their commitment to look after each other, their duty of care, their support, their development, their future prospects. I think we need to have a broader dashboard of what people success looks like. And as I said earlier on, linking all of that together, the people operations team and the practice leads look after our compliance and legal and employment law introduction. They look after our employer brands. They help us with our talent acquisition strategy. And they absolutely help us with ongoing onboarding, ongoing belonging, performance, and learning and career trajectories. So that's my proposition. That's what I think an HR futuristic model might look like. And you may be sitting there thinking, wow, I'm some way off that. I might like it, but how on earth do I get there? I hope you'll recognize some of the traits are still absolutely what we need to be delivering within an HR function. But the reframe, I think, is really important. We need to think about ourselves in much more of a dynamic, adaptive, but scientific and evidence-led version. So if you haven't got any org psychologists within, that's something to perhaps think about as a future capability that you need to strengthen within your HR team, and leverage that evidence and influence that brings perhaps to board conversations about motivation and recruitment techniques. So how do we do that? I think we start with setting our ambition. If we want to move to a model like this, we've got to think, well, what's the current reality of where we are, both capabilities, influence, model, resource, and so on. But also couple that with our ambition. So our ambition and our reality can come together to give us a very practical appraisal of where we are and where we want to be. Then start thinking about what's the purpose of the HR team now, and the vision for it, and the emergent strategy and the values that we have within the HR team, and how do they align and are congruent with the organisation? And does the organisation's purpose, vision, strategy and values need to have some form of amendment, update and reimagining? And then start thinking, how do we liberate teams? How do we create capacity? How do we get the right culture and ownership and change so that we can start to build iteratively, again, important, as Ashish said earlier on, from where we are now to a model that is much more dynamic and much more future focused like this. And then how do we make that operationalized? How do we turn that into processes, systems, technology-enabled changes that can really strengthen the proposition and the value that people feel HR creates for them? And then ultimately, we've got to analyze all of that and invest in our people. So either bringing new people into the HR arena from outside who've got those capabilities so we can learn from them, and or develop ourselves to pick up more of these kind of specialist areas, but also the interconnections between them. It won't be an overnight job. And as Ashish said earlier on, 3 years in the making for the people experience example that he talked about earlier on. So this could be our 2030 vision. It could be our 2030 model, and we can work and iterate towards it. So perhaps that model I came up with in 2017 is a stepping stone and a transition towards this kind of model. So in the spirit of Star Wars, I've taken from The Mandalorian that this is the way. There is a stated intent. There is a destination for us. There is a trajectory. There's absolutely a way that HR doesn't have to look and be like it is right now. It can be bold, dynamic, it can be visionary, and it can pivot and adapt to the kind of model that I've talked about there. And that's all from me. Thanks for hearing all about that. And as I said earlier on, our mission is about better business for a better world. And I think HR's got a strong opportunity now to reposition itself, reimagine itself, to create those better businesses that will help us with some of those bigger macro problems. Thank you, and back to Mihai.
Barry, that was absolutely fantastic. We do have, of course, many questions will be coming. And I'm sure people will reach out to you. Unfortunately, time is pressing, but we might maybe have 1 or 2 questions. So
sure.
Question from Joseph Fogita earlier on, starting the presentation, about which are some of the triggers advancing changes in HR roles, which measures should be undertaken to ensure that HR continues to give direction and leadership when called upon in times of challenges?
Yeah, I think the influence thing is crucial, right? So I think during COVID, we held organizations together from a welfare sense. And I think now we can start to point to, we're good at that. Let us help you with sustainable performance thereafter. But I think we need data and science to help us do that. So I think we don't just go with a sort of heartfelt plea. We have to get the head really strongly engaged. So if you haven't got good people intelligence and data now, now's the time to get it. And now's the time to weave it into your business cases.
Brilliant. Where do you see OD sitting in this model of yours?
Yeah, so I think it's very strong in the systems designer aspect. And really what I see at the moment is OD is a little bit of a best kept secret. It's a little bit buried, and it shouldn't be. It absolutely should be almost like a vanguard type of operation, right? So I see it in lots of experimental test and learn type principles in that system design arena. Its work is never done. OD's work is never done, because as soon as you've crafted a model, you've got to then test it's working well and adapt and adjust and continue to iterate upon that. So I think they are at the helm of that systems designers area, linked very strongly to the meaning makers and the analysts.
And you mentioned it's a long vision towards 2030. So people who started with Ulrich, of course, Ulrich himself is reinventing himself continuously,
Totally.
organizing guidance system, so on and so forth. How do you get executive buy-in? That you say that, okay, now we need to move towards a more ambitious goal?
Yeah, I think staged, and I think gently and experimentally. So if the only thing people take away from this is they think about the things they do as products, start to think about product management as a discipline. So you can Google search that. It operates very strongly in the tech world. Start thinking, can we create a product management approach within HR? And I think that's where I'd start, and link that then back to the systems designer. So I think you don't need to necessarily even relabel people as product managers. Just have that product management discipline. It's so strong and it's so powerful. That's where I'd start.
Brilliant. Perry Chins, thank you so much.